Hello, my curious cats, and welcome back to another episode of the Psychology Podcast, the podcast for all the info on psychology's most questionable history. I'm your host, Leslie Lopez, PhD student and psychology nerd. I know I say this like every single episode, but honestly, you guys, just thank you so much for your constant support. I know I haven't been posting a lot lately, and that's completely on me. There's just so much going on that it's really hard to balance things out. If you guys follow me on my socials, particularly on my Insta, you guys know that I've been in El Salvador for a little over a month now, going on 2 months. It's not quite the vacation I was hoping for. I mean, I'm still working remotely. I'm still going to school online. I mean, most of my PhD is online except for like residency, which I just did before I came here. And then I do have another one coming up in a few months. But other than that, it's just, I'm here with my family, and there's like a bunch of construction projects that we've had on our minds for a while now. And this was the time to do it. So that's just how life works. But anyways, enough about me. How are you guys? How is everybody? What is the 411 of y'all's lives right now, okay? I'm nosy. Tell me everything. Anybody else have an extremely stressful summer? I mean, given everything that's going on right now, I wouldn't be surprised if everybody said yeah. Everybody raise your hand. Yeah. Who else has been victimized by summer of 2024? Okay. So, you know what always sounds good whenever you're just feeling super stressed out? A nice little lobotomy. Sometimes you just want to take like a drill and just and just hoping it'll change something in there, rewire something. Well, anyway, speaking of lobotomies, this week we are looking at the history of lobotomies, how they impacted the psychology and medical field, and the lasting influence on our world today. So, if you're a little bit insane in the membrane like me, get cozy tozy and let's jump into it. Now, before I keep going, you guys can obviously tell this is not my usual setup. This is not my usual sound. And that's because I've been here longer than I was initially planning to. I did have some episodes pre-recorded, but those have already been posted. And I didn't want to keep you guys waiting for so long. And I love doing this, so I kind of miss doing this. So forgive me, I don't have my usual equipment. I don't have my microphone. I don't have my LED light. I don't have my setup, but it is what it is, okay? This is not gonna be a long-term thing. Let's just keep it rolling, okay? So, if you remember from our last episode, we learned about the history behind trepanning, which is when a hole was drilled through a person's skull to fix a fractured skull from an injury, as well as alleviate any pooling blood left behind from a traumatic injury. If you haven't checked that episode yet, I highly suggest you do, because it's like a segue to today's episode. Trepanning was around for centuries, okay? We're talking since like ancient Egyptian times. However, the procedure became extinct when doctors realized that the cons did not outweigh the pros. So, trepanning ended in the early 1800s, and in the late 1800s, like around 1880, to be exact, lobotomies were officially introduced. Now, what exactly is a lobotomy? A lobotomy is a neurosurgical procedure with the goal to treat psychiatric disorders. The doctor obstructs the nerve pathways between the frontal lobe and the thalamus so that there no longer is a connection between them and other areas of the brain. The doctor does this by drilling 2 holes in the patient's head and then injecting pure ethyl alcohol into the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex specifically because it is the area of the brain that regulates all of our thoughts, actions, and emotions, with extensive connections that stretch all the way throughout the brain. Doctors believed that by cutting off those connections, it would reduce abnormal stimuli from reaching the prefrontal cortex. It was these abnormal stimuli which doctors believed caused impulsive and violent behaviors, and the lobotomy would make the patient calm and docile so that they could go on and live their normal lives, still with the mental illness, just without the angry symptoms. The lobotomy was used to cure a number of psychiatric disorders, including depression, anxiety, OCD, psychosis, schizophrenia, and, at the time, homosexuality. Because, back then, being gay was seen as a mental disorder. Okay, so now let's look at the different types of lobotomies. Yes, you heard that right. There are more than one type of lobotomies. 5 to be exact. The first and most commonly known type of lobotomy was the prefrontal lobotomy. In this procedure, doctors would either drill a hole through the skull into the prefrontal cortex or remove a piece of the skull using surgical tools to then divide certain white matter connections that led to the prefrontal cortex. This is the most common known lobotomy. It's the kind you think about when you hear the word lobotomy. Think of it like a fun new piercing to your brain, okay? Like so quirky and so different from all your friends. Who wouldn't want one of those? The second most common type of lobotomy was the transorbital lobotomy, also known as the ice pick lobotomy. In this procedure, the aim was similar to the prefrontal lobotomy, where they access the prefrontal cortex to sever certain white matter connections to the prefrontal cortex. However, the procedure itself was a bit different. Instead of drilling a hole through the skull, the doctor would drill through the eye socket, okay, using a surgical instrument that resembled an ice pick. And actually, in some cases, it was a little ice pick that you would get at like the grocery store or your kitchen counter. This is the lobotomy that comes to my mind when I think of the word lobotomy. Like, did y'all ever catch the Netflix original Ratched starring Sarah Paulson? I loved her in American Horror, so when I saw that she was starring in this TV show, I was like, I have to watch this. And again, she did not disappoint, okay? It's kind of like a spin-off of the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but the nurse's point of view of that movie, which also a great movie. Loved it. And Sarah Paulson, she plays the nurse working in the insane asylum that performs lobotomies in the early 1900s, and many of those scenes that they would show the procedure of included this method, the ice pick method. So whenever I think of lobotomies, because I love that show so much, this is like the first one that comes to mind. Great show, by the way. If you haven't watched it, I highly suggest you do, unless you're not into like gory kind of things. I kind of stay away from it, but if you're into that, I highly suggest it. The third type of lobotomy was a tepectomy. This procedure had the doctors drilling a hole through the skull, similar to the prefrontal lobotomy, except instead of just severing certain prefrontal connections, they would remove parts of the prefrontal cortex altogether. Which, I'm no expert, I made that pretty clear, but I would assume that removing actual whole parts of the brain couldn't be much better than severing parts. But what do I know? The fourth type of lobotomy was the neuroinjection of sclerosis agents. Long name and even longer confusion. So with this procedure, the doctors would drill 2 holes, one on each side of the skull, and then inject pure ethyl alcohol into the patient's prefrontal cortex. The alcohol was supposed to disrupt the neuron tracks by entering through the prefrontal cortex and hardening the white matter. Think of it like a dam inside your skull. Gnarly, right? The fifth and final type of lobotomy was the subcaudate tractotomy lobotomy. Whew, that's quite the mouthful. But this one, doctors didn't disrupt or remove the white matter connections inside the brain. Instead, they destroyed said white matter altogether through, again, drilling 2 holes through the patient's skull. Okay, so now we know the 5 different types of lobotomies that were all introduced particularly at the same time in the early 1900s. Neither of them sound fun or promising, if we're being honest. Also, not so fun fact, these patients didn't receive any anesthetic solution before their procedures. The doctors would instead knock them out cold through electroshock therapy. Like, talk about a splitting headache. But also, if you don't know what that is, electroshock therapy, stick around for the next episode. Alright, so let's take a closer look into the history of lobotomies, and they have quite the lore, so stick with me, okay? Technically, the first ever recorded lobotomy wasn't even done on a human. Okay, let's start there. Please welcome our first guest, Dr. Frederick Goltz, a German psychologist who in the late 1700s performed brain ablations experiments on dogs. Brain ablations consist of surgically removing brain tissue to treat violent behavior. Dr. Goltz would perform these brain ablation on dogs and observes distinct changes in their behavior. And he wasn't the only one performing these procedures per se, but he was the one who influenced our next guest. Let's please welcome to the stage Dr. Gottlieb Burckhardt. Dr. Burckhardt was a Swiss medical director of a small insane asylum in the small town of Neuchâtel, Switzerland. Throughout his career, Dr. Burckhardt carried a wide interest in the studies and research of mental illness, like what causes them, potential cures, etc. Much of his publications were dedicated to the psychiatric and neurological research findings, including his thesis of mental illness that had origins in specific regions of the brain. In 1882, he began his career as a medical doctor at a Swiss insane asylum where he put his research into practice. His position included his own laboratory to continue the research on some of the patients at the asylum. Soon, he was officially putting his research to practice by taking 6 patients and conducting a procedure where he would cut out different brain regions that he believed were the cause of the mental illness. His logic was there, like, I kind of get it, okay? Like, he essentially believed that if he eliminated the mental illness part of the brain, he would eliminate the mental illness, which I guess makes kind of sense. Like I said, I think like his logic is kind of there for an 1800s, right? For the 1800s, like, do you know what I mean? I mean, obviously his logic is completely insane, but for the 1800s, I get it, you know? An important fact to point out about Dr. Burckhardt was that he wasn't exactly looking for a cure for the patient of the mental disorder, but rather to minimize their symptoms by putting them in like a calm state of mind. Sadly, 2 of his 6 experimental patients did die, but nonetheless, Dr. Burckhardt was so excited to share his findings that in 1889, he reported his results at a medical conference in Germany, where he was sadly ridiculed and laughed at. This made Dr. Burckhardt continue his research activities, quit his research activities cold turkey. Like, it's kind of sad. I mean, he was bullied into quitting what he was passionate about. And he was only trying to help these patients. Like, I truly believe he was just trying to help them. And I mean, like, sure, it wasn't the best plan, but I mean, I don't know. His intentions were good, I think. But anyways, fast forward to the 1930s. See how quick that was? From the 1700s to the 1900s? And that's because after Dr. Burckhardt, very little attempt had been made to literally dig inside the human skull. That is, until we discovered monkeys. Well, introduced monkeys to the field of science. Let's please welcome our next guests, neuroscientists Dr. Carlisle Jacobson and Dr. John Fulton. In 1935, these 2 neuroscientists presented the results of an experiment they conducted where they performed brain ablations, remember those? Specifically to the prefrontal lobes of chimpanzees. The neuroscientists would get the chimpanzees all rattled up by withholding reward sensors, like think Pavlov, but kind of like with monkeys. They would then take the angry chimpanzees, perform the brain ablations, and record their findings. Obviously, there's so much more to this, but that's just kind of like a quick synopsis for this episode. They found that by aiming specifically for the prefrontal cortex, the chimpanzees became docile and their angry rampage just went away. As you could imagine, these findings were significantly groundbreaking in the neuroscience community. Heck, they would be significantly groundbreaking if they were around today. Believe me, the last thing I would want to do is call this terrible time in history a trend. But in a way, that's really how it was among doctors. How I see it is like plastic surgery these days. One doctor started performing BBLs, and soon after, almost every plastic surgeon out there was performing BBLs. It's become such a demand that there are black market doctors performing such surgeries at a much lower cost, but at a much higher risk. Similar with lobotomies, one neurosurgeon was performing lobotomies, and soon after, another doctor was performing lobotomies, and so on. In 1935, neurophysicians Antonio Egas Moniz and Pedro Almeida Lima performed the first legitimately known lobotomy among a human patient at the Hospital de Santa Marta in Lisbon. Their intention was to remove some of the long fibers that connected the frontal lobe to other major regions of the brain by drilling 2 holes in the patient's head and then injecting pure ethyl alcohol into the prefrontal cortex. If you remember from earlier, this is the neuroinjection lobotomy, which was essentially destroying the connecting fibers and creating a barrier with the alcohol. This very first lobotomy was deemed a success because the patient actually lived. According to the surgeons and hospital staff, the patient's depression was cured. Seeing how successful the first surgery was, these 2 doctors went on to perform over 40 lobotomies in the span of 2 years, male and female, ranging from ages 27 to 62. The patients all suffered from a variety of mental illness, from depression to schizophrenia to madness to homosexuality. Although all 40 patients survived the procedure, only a third were noted to have been completely cured, a third to have been somewhat cured, and a third relapsed. The fact that they all survived is pretty incredible in itself, considering the side effects of the procedure, which, by the way, included uncontrollable vomiting and bladder/bowel movements. Some of the patients came out of surgery with a lazy eye that wasn't there pre-procedure. Often, in trying to cure mental illness, the patients would gain new psychological disorders as an outcome of the procedure. For example, after the procedure, some patients had completely lost muscle movement. Some patients were even recorded to have kleptomania as a side effect, which is, if you don't know, the uncontrollable urge to steal things. These are just a few of the side effects, and it's honestly so insane. Like, they saw all this and were like, I mean, yeah, they have a new lazy eye now and the uncontrollable bladder thing, and then they also, like, all of a sudden steal things out of control. But look, they're no longer depressed. They're cured. Jazz hands. Despite all these controversial side effects, the practice was soon widely adopted, largely because there were really no other procedures being tested or researched for mental illness at the time. Throughout the 1930s, the procedure quickly made its way around countries such as Brazil, Cuba, Italy, Romania, and eventually the US. Now, let's welcome to the stage our next lobotomy experts, American neurologist Dr. Walter Freeman II and Dr. James Watts. Dr. Freeman was actually the one who coined the term prefrontal lobotomy, and his protocol was actually turned into the standard procedure for the lobotomy that we typically know today. In the beginning of their lobotomy careers, Freeman and Watts continued with the trepanning technique, which is the hole drilling on the side of the skull. However, in the early 1940s, Freeman decided there had to be a simpler and more effective way to get the same results without the damaging of the skull. So one day in 1945, while he was home cooking dinner, he took an ice pick from his kitchen drawer and began testing the insertion of the ice pick on a grapefruit. Completely normal, right? He soon took that same ice pick to the institute where he worked and began testing the procedure on approaching the frontal lobes through the eye socket on cadavers. Again, completely normal, right? And the transorbital lobotomy was officially born in 1946. This procedure was groundbreaking for the medical community for a number of reasons, but most specifically because of how quick it was. Because the doctors weren't drilling holes in the patient's heads, the procedure was considered almost less invasive. I mean, like, the whole ice pick procedure literally only took like 10 minutes. Thinking about it now, it's insane. I mean, that's so sketchy. Like, why was no one questioning it? Well, it turns out there was at least one person who was questioning the whole thing. The dream team of Freeman and Watts soon became just Freeman, because Watts did not approve of Freeman's techniques. More often than not, Freeman wasn't even performing the procedures in a proper hospital setting with trained staff in a sterile environment. Freeman was handing out lobotomies left and right, in random office settings without proper sterilization, proper tools, and when anesthesia wasn't available, he continued to use electroshock therapy to knock the patients out cold before the procedure. Watts claimed and made it very clear to the public that Freeman was unorganized, lacked cleanliness, and most of all, lacked the proper knowledge because, get this, Freeman wasn't licensed to perform brain surgery. Watts was like, I am not putting my career on the line for this guy's insane ideas. I'm out. And good for him. Did no one else know about this, honestly? Like, see, this is what I mean. This is what I meant earlier as it being kind of a trend. Just because you hold the knowledge does not mean that you all of a sudden are qualified. It's like that whole mess with veneer technicians lately. Have y'all heard about that? Please tell me y'all have heard and kept up with that, okay? It's essentially people are taking a 1-week class to gain certification in veneers. Veneers, as in that procedure that only actual dentists, certified licensed, state board certified DDSs should be doing. But no, these people are taking week courses to gain the knowledge of doing veneers on other people, and the people actually getting their veneers done by these certified technicians. And then it turns out that the person administrating the classes wasn't even a dentist himself. Please, okay, please tell me y'all have heard about this, because I was so baffled when I found out about this. And there's like lawsuits coming out on the whole thing, and it's just a whole mess of the thing. And just please, if you haven't, go check it out. Veneer technicians, insane. But anyways, back to lobotomies. The use of lobotomies in the US was criticized heavily by the American neurosurgeons at first, but when they saw the Freeman's success, the lobotomy quickly became known as a miracle procedure, gaining traction among the American public, and soon came the overwhelming demand of the procedure. So, because the procedure was being received with lots of love, the public and even the doctors themselves seemed to overlook all of its side effects, including apathy, poor concentration, and lack of emotional depth. Also, not to mention, recorded deaths due to complication from the procedure were beginning to surface. Now, it's important to note that these are all short-term effects. I mean, besides death, obviously. Because the procedure was still relatively new, the long-term effects were unknown at the time. Between the early 1940s and late 1960s, Freeman himself performed and supervised over 3,500 lobotomies across the US. That's just Freeman, and that's just the US, by the way. By 1951, at its peak, almost 20,000 lobotomies had been performed across the US by doctors all around. Interestingly, shockingly, sadly enough, an estimated of 40% of those lobotomies were performed on gay men whose families believed homosexuality was a mental illness and hoped the lobotomy would turn them straight. This was just in the US, okay? I think I mentioned this like 3 times now. All over the world, lobotomies were being performed. It's estimated that by the early 1970s, over 40,000 lobotomies had been performed in the US, 17,000 in England, about 5,000 in Sweden, over 4,000 in Denmark, thousands more in Japan, the USSR, Brazil, and many, many more. And those are just the recorded lobotomies. A lobotomy cost a patient about $250 back then, which is almost $6,000 today. That's as much as braces cost, by the way. Or at least that's how much they cost me. So what would often happen is that in the depths of desperation, mentally ill patients and their families would go to doctors for these procedures. For all we know, these numbers are actually much, much higher and the risks much, much greater. It's also known that in many countries, lobotomies were even being performed on children with behavioral and learning problems. Listen, I myself have undiagnosed ADHD, and I have since I was a little girl, from what I remember, from what I can tell. I can't fathom the thought of children whose brains haven't even fully developed, by the way, going through this god-awful procedure. innocents' lives being affected just because they're overly hyper or can't grasp the concept of long division. It kills me inside just to think about it, because there's a lot of close people in my life who I know would have been victims of lobotomies at the instance of their own families had they been around during the peak of lobotomies. Undoubtedly, lobotomies were always viewed with criticism. However, doctors and desperate patients turned a blind eye. In 1948, Dr. Norbert Weider claimed that, quote, prefrontal lobotomies have recently been having a certain vogue, probably not unconnected with the fact that it makes the custodial care of many patients easier. Let me remark that killing them makes them their custodial care still easier. Okay? Can I just say, this diva? Okay, he saw right through Freeman and his dangerous procedure. Lobotomies were never intended to actually cure the patient and give them a fair chance at life. It was about giving the ones taking care of them an easier life, whether the patient was brain dead or just dead. By 1970, most countries had banned the procedure altogether. This is also due to the fact that in the 1970s, the use of antipsychotic medication and antidepressants were quickly making a much safer, cheaper, and sure introduction into the field of medicine. In 1977, U.S. Congress, under the Jimmy Carter administration, which, side note, he just turned 100, the first ever U.S. president to make it to triple digits. Happy birthday, Jimmy boy. Anyways, under his presidency, it was declared that lobotomies were actually being used to control minorities and restrain individual rights. Took us long enough, but we finally made it. Nope. However, because we are in the US, lobotomies were never actually banned. The US never banned lobotomies, and the procedure was still being performed well into the 1980s. Today, lobotomies are still technically legal and rarely performed, though. It is, however, a much more refined procedure that, again, is rarely performed and actually goes by the name cingulotomy. That is essentially the history of the lobotomy, although honestly, I could go on and on about the procedure and what it did to humanity, including some very notable cases like that of Rosemary Kennedy and Joseph Hasid. Well, my curious cats, thank you so much for coming along with me on this ridiculous ride. Give me your thoughts on today's episode, along with any suggestions you may have for future episodes down in the comment section. I want to know what y'all want to know. Follow the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And don't forget to also give it a follow on Instagram to stay up to date at the Say Psychology Podcast for all episodes updates. As always, citations will be in the description if you want to check those out. Stay blessed, stay sane, and stay psyched. I love you. Bye.